Gareth Hughes.
Kia, ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. It's a great honour to be speaking here on the second reading of this bill. I guess what we're seeing today is why it's so important to have the Greens in Parliament, because I haven't heard a single person talk about the consequences of this bill on the environment or on our communities. We've talked about how this bill is going to make it cheaper. We've talked about how this bill will make it cheaper for aircraft to finance aircraft and other heavy items. No one's talked about what the impacts are going to be. The fact is aircraft emissions have grown 73% in the last 40 years. This is vitally important because climate change is the most greatest threat facing the planet. I'll let the Honourable Minister map, I don't know what he said, but a relatively small percentage. Well, I'd like to touch on that. It's around 3%, as the Minister will be aware. But as the Minister will also be aware, there's significant debates globally about what the actual emissions and the global warming potential of those aircraft emissions on the planet. It's not just the carbon dioxide emissions, it's also the nitrous oxide emissions, which have a greenhouse potential of nearly 300 times over a 100-year time frame. There's also the radiative forcing effects from the contrails, which certain Labour ministers are aware of, which are condensation clouds at high levels, and also the impacts of water vapour and soot. So some scientists estimate it could be up to 10% of global emissions. So I hear the Minister's what he's saying, but I think what we're hearing is that... Thank you to my colleague Mr Hughes, but I want to get back to the issue, which is climate change. The greatest impact... Well, what we're discussing today is aircraft and making it cheaper and more likely to see those aircraft emissions continue. It is a big issue because greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand and around the world are rising. Gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, it's not just a problem for the polar bears anymore. Climate change is a problem facing the planet right now. Last year, Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, published a report saying that 300,000 people die right now as a result of climate change. Not in 10 years, not in 20 years, we're not just talking about the polar bears, we're talking about right now. We heard in 2007 from Sir Nicholas Stern, from the Stern Review, that it's cheaper to take action now. Sure, it's expensive to tackle climate change, and we hear about that almost daily from Mr Boscawen. The cost of tackling climate change are on the order of 2% of global GDP. Not an insignificant number, but when you look at the estimates of the costs of climate change in our lifetimes, we're looking at potentially 20% of global gross domestic product being affected by climate change. The time to act is now, and if we're going to keep increasing our emissions from our aircraft in New Zealand and around the world, where else are we going to make these cuts, these needed cuts, to stay within the safe climatic band, which is 350 parts per million? This bill makes it cheaper to own and operate a bill, which I guess we all agree with, don't we? This is what we're talking about today, but we're not asking the important questions. This is, do we want to increase air travel in New Zealand? Do we want to make an essentially unsustainable sector continue to grow when we know the impacts of climate change? We know oil is not going to get any cheaper. What we've seen in Louisiana over the last couple of months is oil drillers are having to go further out, deeper, further out into more extreme environments because those easy sources of oil have already been tapped. We're reaching what's described as peak oil, which is the end of cheap oil, and the members of the Finance Committee would have heard about that today with a letter from Dr Russell Norman, and I hope that committee can have an inquiry into it. It's an important issue because in New Zealand, some nearly 10 years ago, we sunk over $800 million into saving our national airline. It's an important issue, but as the price of fuel continues to increase, we're going to see lessening usage internationally and lessening returns on our considerable investment. I think it's a major issue for New Zealand in terms of our brand. The Green Party is talking about this a lot because I think what we're seeing in this Parliament at the moment is a stark contrast in vision. On one side, we're going to mine our treasured places. We're going to try and squeeze more dairy production, 4% a year, continual growth. We're going to keep investing in mad motorways that don't make economic sense. And on the other side, we could be focusing on our clean and green brand, making that a reality, focusing on premium products. And this is what tourists, the hundreds of thousands of tourists that are flying here every year, and they're asking considerably these questions more and more. With the Rugby World Cup next year, we've got 80,000 people potentially coming to New Zealand. We're going to have maybe 1 billion people watching. But what we're going to see is the Rugby World Cup could become like China and the questions raised about human rights there. It could become like South Africa and the questions raised around racism and housing issues there. Will the World Cup highlight our hypocrisy on our green issues? The fact that we're not facing up to our growth in airline emissions, the fact we're not facing up to any sector growth of emissions in New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, I wish today we were debating a bill which would see aircraft become more sustainable, because I'm not a doom and gloom merchant. There are options available for aircraft industries worldwide. I wish we were discussing the Wellington Convention if we went around the world pushing for more stringent aircraft sustainability standards. I wish we were pushing for greenhouse gas emissions from the aircraft and shipping industries, which are so far not counted under the Kyoto Protocol. If we were actually including those gases in our Kyoto register, including it into our emissions trading scheme, because it is going to happen one day. And the sooner we face up to the fact that our considerable 3.4 million tonnes of emissions coming from our international aircraft sector is massive and will be counted one day, we may as well start facing up to the truth. So, sir, in summary, I am disappointed no one else in the House has raised these sustainability issues and asked the core question, which is, sure, we want to make it cheaper for aircraft to operate in New Zealand and globally, but do we actually want to? Do we want to support, do we want to keep subsidising through our emissions trading scheme the aircraft industry, which is in New Zealand, which is being subsidised for its pollution, when we know we don't have a second planet? Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.